Israel is clearly the crossroads of all these empires.
Yeah,
who are
100%.
Is there any one point where they kind of acknowledge that, and not that it's an issue of are you obedient to God's will, and that's how you will, is there kind of the geopolitical idea ever brought in or not?
I think it's clear in the book. It's clear in the book, and I think that you're talking about a political situation.
Yeah.
But it's not the main focus of the book. The focus of the book is clearly, obedience to God, keeping the covenant and all that. But there's also the reality of the politics. There's essentially Israel, as you say, is a crossroads. You're caught in between, and it still is even more complicated. You have you have Babel up north. First, you have the Assyrians before that. Then you have the Egyptians in the south.
Right.
Those are the two main powers. And then what happens is in 605, you have a great battle, Carchemish, where Babylon is dominant. And then basically you got to deal with reality. And the part of the reality of the book is that the kings of Israel and many of the leaders are hoping, and many of the other countries, because there's an attempt to make a confederacy of the other countries, which is also important in the book. The book speaks about that. It doesn't hide that. But the hope is that the political, question is, what should Israel do? Should Israel cast its lot with Assyria and with Egypt, especially Egypt, hopefully to weaken the Babylonians because they're the immediate threat? Or should you simply side with the Babylonians, deal with reality, and forget about the others? And that's a political question. And it's clear in the book Yirmiyahu, from beginning to end, both in terms of the Jews and the non-Jews as well, says that Babylon is ascendant, and you got to just accept it and don't fight them. And if you don't fight them, you'll be able to survive and live in peace. And the others don't resist that. And the book does not hide the politics, and that's clear. But the focus of the book is, covenant, keeping the loyalty to God and all that. So it's complicated in that way. And you're right, it's exactly the crossroads. It's exactly in between. And what happens actually, this doesn't appear in Yirmiyahu, but it's important in Malachim that the last good king, which is Yoshiyahu, he's killed basically because he tries to stop Paro from crossing. Paro's traveling up north to fight the Assyrians, not to fight the Jews. And Yoshiyahu intercepts him at Megiddo, Armageddon. It's Armageddon, and he's killed there. So that's a political decision that he makes. The Book of Chronicles, which has its own spin on things, tries to turn this into a religious disobedience. It makes the amazing. He was warned by God through Pharaoh. It says. I mean. God has many messengers, God is Bilam's ass is also a messenger. But the fact is, that's very strange. So you raise a central question basically in the book. I don't think the book hides this at all. But again, it's not the focus. So
Also, is there a sense of how many people is the population, the majority of people are kind of on the right path, and it's just a small segment that Yirmiyahu is kind of condemning, or is it more widespread?
My take on the book, these things are not totally clear because there are many conflicting prophecies. But my take on the book, for the most part, is that most of the people have abandoned the right path, but that they are led there by the leaders. That the leadership is blamed, that is the prophets, which we talked about last week and just finished up this week. The priests and the prophets and the king. Those are the main, and there are other political leaders as well. Those are the forces. The book clearly condemns the king, that's for sure. And the story that is most striking is when, we'll get there. The next semester, the stories are way more interesting because they're more about Yirmiyahu's personal life and his personal struggles, which are interwoven with the prophecies. But one of the famous stories that we'll get to, just to mention it now because it touches on that basic question, is the story where Yirmiyahu was in jail. He's in jail a lot, by the way, and a lot of different jails also. So he's in jail, and he receives word from God to dictate his prophecies, which he's already given. Sounds like they're not new prophecies. To dictate his prophecies to his scribe. His scribe who will factor in later on in the year. We'll get to this. His name is Baruch. So his scribe, Baruch ben Neriah, is a scribe. He is to dictate the prophecies that he's already spoken to Baruch. Baruch is to write them down in a scroll. And Baruch is to take the scroll to the temple on a fast day, it says. Wait till on the fast day, and he's to read it publicly on the fast day. Where's that chapter? Let's see. That's later on, of course, in the book. It's a very, very interesting chapter. What chapter is that? That's keep the chapter straight. That should be what, in the 30s, I think. No, let's see. Where is it? I don't remember. I can't get the chapters. 36. Chapter 36. Chapter 36. And then we'll get back to our topic. But this is everything's relevant. So this is a very, very famous and important chapter. Chapter 36 of Yirmiyahu. He's in jail, so he's commanded to dictate the prophecies, and Baruch is writing them down. He writes down word for word what Yirmiyahu says, and then he commands Baruch to, on the fast day, go to the temple. A lot of the prophecies of Yirmiyahu are given from the temple itself. It's another interesting point we'll get to. But go to the temple and to read this scroll. So Baruch does that. He waits till the fast day, which is, I believe, in the 9th month. Let's see. Where does it say this? It says 9. 36. Yeah, that's right. 9th month, which is Kislev. That's us right now. So this is the month of Kislev. 9th month is Kislev. So he reads it's a fast day for some reason. It doesn't say it's a fast day. And he reads the scroll. And in this, the people, there's some of the important people hear this being read in the temple from the scroll, and they inform other major officers of the country, Sarim, and they send for Baruch, and they ask Baruch to read it to them, so they all hear it. And when they hear this, they're very concerned about the prophecies that are being read. And Pachadu Isha Rayehu in verse 16. Where's the scroll coming from? Oh, Yirmiyahu, the prophet Yirmiyahu dictated it to me. I wrote it every word down. Okay. And they say to Baruch, you better hide. You better hide. You hide. And no one should know where you are. Exactly. And then they get a message to the king. Message to the king about this scroll. They're very concerned, and the king sends his own messenger named Yehudi to take the scroll. Then you have the scene, which is a very famous scene, and actually speaks to Zella's point. And the scene is this: the king is living in his winter home. The king, Beit HaChoref. Now, by the way, I believe that is a critique in this book, because elsewhere it's not as strong. In Amos, you have a very powerful critique about the people living in the lap of luxury. You know what I mean? That's a strong critique. So here, the winter home. Meanwhile, Yirmiyahu's in jail. You understand? He's one jail to the next. This guy has his winter home, and they bring him the scroll with the prophecies, and he's sitting there in front of the fire. So they start to read it to him, and every few columns he rips it off. He cuts it with a scribe's knife, it says, and he throws it into the fire. And meanwhile, the other people says, beg him not to do that. They said, don't do that. You know, the others, they're frightened. But he and his little inside group doesn't care about this, and he throws it in, and then he says, send me Baruch and Yirmiyah. He wants to kill them. So it says that God allowed them to run away, to hide them. And Baruch goes back to Yirmiyah, and he tells him what happened. It's all burned. And God says to Yirmiyah, write another scroll. Write it again. And Yirmiyah writes it again, and he has an additional side message for the king, who is Yehoiakim, who's a terrible person. And at the end of it, it says, and he also added more words. He's mostly now. The reason I mentioned the story now, hopefully we come back to the story someday. But you see from the story one interesting thing, and that is in terms of Zella's question, which is the reason I deal with it. It's a core question in the book, actually. Who are the bad guys here? And from this story, you see one thing for sure, and which is a very important point. The king is the main bad guy, because all the other people, the king has this little internal coterie, but all the other people have a lot of, I mean, I say the king, I mean Yehoiakim. Tzidkiyahu is different, actually. Tzidkiyahu is weak. He actually has mixed feelings. He actually wants to do the right thing, but he's too weak to do it. But Yehoiakim is just straight up bad guy. And there's a story earlier where he actually kills a prophet, another prophet, he kills him. So the story over here suggests to us that the main people in power, which is the king and his group, they're the ones controlling the country, and everybody else could potentially go either way. But because of the king and the way that it's set up, it's probably a critique of kingship as well, above everything else. That's the situation. So that's my take on the book, is that the as it were, they do a lot of bad things, and they're punished for it very severely. But fundamentally, Yirmiyahu, here he addresses the people, but very often he addresses mostly the ruling class, and he also gives his speeches inside the temple. He goes into the temple and he says this temple is going to be destroyed. So that's very striking. That he's going to the public places, but in particular, that story, chapter 36, I think speaks to your question about who are the main villains in the book of Yirmiyahu. Okay, that's as far as that's concerned. We'll come back to this question because it's a very basic question. I also doing this for 929. They asked me this, so I agreed to do Yirmiyahu. I'm actually, as I prepare this class, I prepare that. I never actually read Yirmiyahu from beginning to end, pasuk by pasuk. You come to it all the time, but when you read something, the whole thing from first verse to last verse, you get a certain picture of it. You know what I mean? And I find this book very interesting from many perspectives. First of all, there's the personal side. There's no other prophet like this, whose personal story is so there. And basically, he bounces around from one jail to the next. They try to kill him on several occasions. He barely manages to escape twice, barely. But there is that story at the end. I'll just mention it now. We'll come back to it, which is very striking. It's actually really the last chapter about where Yirmiyahu deals with the people is chapter 44. And the second semester we'll get to these chapters. But in that chapter, I can't just mention what it is. The way the book ends, actually, the Yirmiyahu's life, he goes to Egypt. It's very striking. That the fact that the Jews went to Egypt is mentioned in the book of Kings. I mean, in Malachim, it says in one verse, and after Gedaliah is assassinated, and the Jews and the nation is dispersed, and they go to Egypt. That's the one verse. But in the book of Yirmiyahu, and we'll deal with this, it's a very central question. What should they do after Gedaliah is killed? Gedaliah. After Gedaliah is killed, what should they do? So they go to Yirmiyahu, and they ask him, please pray to God for us. So Yirmiyahu says, I will, and they say, and whatever God tells us to do, we're going to do. You tell whatever God says, and we promise you this. Exactly, except he says we don't like. But everything he says, we're going to do. So Yirmiyahu prays for them. Now, there are occasions in this book where he refuses to pray on several, and he's told not to pray. That's another interesting question. But here he prays, and God says, listen, tell them the following. If they stay in the land, it's going to be okay. Even though Gedaliah was assassinated and the Babylonians appointed him, and you're afraid they're going to take it out against the Jews because Yishmael killed him, who's Jewishly connected. No, don't worry about that. Stay in the land, and you will be able to prosper. And you have to remember, if you know the story, that after the temple is destroyed, and Gedaliah is made the king, the governor, the Jews from the other countries begin to emigrate to Israel. It's an aliyah from all the other countries. It's amazing, actually. describes this aliyah from. It's the only time we really have this. Outside leaving Egypt, they're all of them coming back from all the different lands, and then Gedaliah is killed. So what should they do? So God says, tell the people not to worry. The Babylonians will not take it against you. Stay with them, etc., etc. So he gives the message, of course. So the people say to him, and there are two responses here. So the first response is, it's not true. God never said that to you. Sheker atol, Mayor, you're lying to us. Someday we'll get to that story. You're lying to us. God never said such a thing. Touches on the question I want to finish with this week. How do you know if the prophet tells you the truth? That's a very central question in the book. Started that last week. Anyway, you're lying to us. We can't stay here. The Babylonians will. On the contrary, maybe there's a plot, conspiracy to get us to exile to Bavel. That's why you're saying this. So they decide to go to Egypt. Yochanan is the main character and his officers, and they go to Egypt, and they take Yirmiyahu with them, and Baruch too. They take them both. What Yirmiyahu would have done had they not taken him is a very interesting question. Who knows? Might have gone anyway. Anyway, that's the story. So that's chapter 43. The last chapter, they're in Egypt. They're in Egypt, and this is amazing. Actually, the last chapter, they're in Egypt, and Yirmiyahu receives a message in Egypt. He says to them, "You've done a terrible thing to come to Egypt, and the Babylonians are going to come here. Actually, they're going to come and get you here, and Egypt will not protect you. Egypt themselves will be defeated by the Babylonians." And then he says, "Listen," he says, "and you've come down to Egypt. And you have all the gods of Egypt and everything, and you're starting to worship the gods of Egypt, and that's why you got here in the first place, because he's talking to the men and the women. The women are emphasized over there, the men and the women. So the women respond to Yirmiyahu, and they say, listen, all those years we used to serve the goddess of heaven. Goddess of heaven. We used to bring sacrifices, and we made vows to the goddess of heaven. And then they say, and our husbands knew about it too. They didn't stop us, And all those years we made vows to the goddess of heaven. This is the last I'm going to say about this. Just the background to the book. This is a very important point about the background. And when we brought sacrifices to the goddess of heaven, everything was great. We had no problems. But then we stopped bringing the sacrifices. We stopped making the vows. And that's when we got in trouble. That's when they got in trouble. Now, the backdrop to this, I presume, is the following. That Yoshiyahu, in the middle of his reign, discovers this scroll. And he makes all these reformations. He tries to rid the country of idolatry. He kills the priests, all kinds of things. And he attempts to set the nation back on the right path as he sees it, as the Bible sees it. But he himself is killed. And after he dies, it's all downhill from there. So his reformations actually don't seem to help at all. Now, why they don't help is the subject of Malachim discusses with it, and Yirmiyahu has hints at why, maybe even in Chronicles, I don't remember. It's a good problem. Guy does all the right things, and we're in exile.
It's not true that even in the finding of the scroll, he's already told that Yehud is not going to survive.
That's true.
Happen in his time.
That is true. He's told right away by Chulda Hanavi. Immediately he's told. Chulda tells him right away. Nonetheless, he undergoes does all the right things, it would appear. So you have a book, Yirmiyahu, in which it's not the same as the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, they said, you're lying to us, God never said it. But in the last chapter, actually, the last time he deals with the people, so you ask about the people say to him, you know something? The women say, the truth of the matter is, we see things very differently. We see our troubles and the exile and all the suffering, not because we worship idolatry, but because we abandoned it. So Yirmiyahu just repeats what he asked. I mean, can you imagine this poor guy, Yirmiyahu? I mean, his whole life, he has one message, basically. And the end of the day, the people say to him, on the contrary, that was our mistake. Now that we're here in Egypt, we have all these gods, And so there you get a sense, in response to your big question about who are the bad guys in the book, there it's not just the leadership. There it's the people. And I say, this was the Hamon Am, and maybe the women there are mentioned for that reason specifically, because they're more about the people. They're more with the people, and so it's a good, important question. The book doesn't spare anybody, but I would come back to the first point in terms of your question, which is that fundamentally there's a tremendous emphasis placed on the king. And he's certainly, and Yehoiakim in particular, was a deadly character. Okay, let me say what we have today and next week. So I thank you for that question. That was a very important question and an important issue in the book. So there are two things I like to do. First of all, just to complete what we started last week, which was to look at two chapters, first of 23, I think 28 was the second. And there the book addresses a very central question, which the Chumash already addresses, namely, how do you know who the true prophet is? Because certainly, Yirmiyahu, we read the book of Yirmiyahu, God put God's word in Yirmiyahu's mouth. But if you go by the numbers game, he's very much outnumbered. There are very few, the prophets, as they're called, and there are many of them, are all saying the opposite of what Yirmiyahu was saying. Quite the opposite. Do not give in to Bavel. It's going to be okay. The exiles will return. King Yechaniah will return, etc., etc. So, again, how can you tell? How do you know? So last week, just to review in 10 seconds the point of last week was, the main point, I think, of last week was that whereas in the Chumash seems to say that if the prophet's word comes true, he's a true prophet. If the prophet's word or prediction does not come true, he's not a true prophet. That's what the Chumash says. The problem with that, we're not the first to see the problem, is that in the interim, how do you know? So-and-so is going to happen in 10 years. Okay, what do I do now? So the Chumash, what the Chumash says, does not seem to give us too much understanding of how one can make a judgment. So our tradition, the Ramban quotes two other points, which are very important, one of which was very much related to what we saw last week. The first point the Ramban made, just to review, was that the sign that they're talking about, and the prophet gives you a sign, it could be true. There are two kinds of signs. There's a sign, next week something will happen, or next year something will happen. So the sign actually is going to come later. But there's another sign where the guy says, I'm going to do something right now. I'm equipped already with an oath today, and then I'm going to go to the people and do my sign, and it's going to happen right now, and that will be a sign that I'm a true prophet. For example, what Moshe has. So Moshe is given oath at the staff, the staff, and he puts his hand and turns leprous and all that, and turning the blood into water into blood. So those are signs that he demonstrates before the people. So that's the second. So they're the sign at least precedes the prophecy. But the other point, which I think is related to what we saw last week, and this is a very important point, which the Rabbi emphasized, which is that essentially a prophet has a reputation. And if someone has a reputation as being an honest person and a prophet, and his prophecies have been seen to be true in the past, then you can rely upon him for the future without a sign. That's the Rambam famous. The people did not rely on Moses because of the signs. Not because of signs. They trusted Moshe because of who he was. And the point of last week in chapter 23 was, and the whole discussion centered around the question, what does it mean to be a person who is trustworthy as a prophet? And I think one of the interesting features of chapter 23 is that the focus is on the nature of the person. Does the person have moral integrity? Does the person's prophecy, does the fact that the person is a prophet change the way the person is? In other words, Yirmiyahu describes himself as somebody, there's a fire burning inside him. And that's part of being a genuine prophet. It's not just delivering messages. The message is bound up with who the person is in a very deep way. And furthermore, it comes at a great cost to Yirmiyahu. So there's a great sacrifice involved in being a prophet. And that we know, generally speaking, is true. But in the case of Yirmiyahu, it's very striking because they constantly want to kill him. To kill him, to beat him. He's beaten, he's imprisoned, he's etc. So that we know. So these are these speak to the nature of the person. So that's an interesting question. So that's different than we have in the Chumash. The Chumash doesn't say that at all. But there are certain elements to the person, and that person who has those elements is somebody you can trust to be a prophet. I would add to this something else that's found in chapter 23, which is that the true prophet is somebody who didn't want to be a prophet to begin with. Because there's a critique over there about God says, all these prophets that are running to the people, I never sent them, and yet they run. So the running to the people is a critique, actually. Because if you understand the nature of the prophecy and the difficulties that you encounter, no rational person would accept that. So you're doing it not because it's something you want to do. As Yirmiyahu says in this book, a person doesn't choose his own path. I know you don't choose your own path. I know the path is difficult. That Yirmiyahu says that. That's what we saw last week. Yes.
You set up the question that in the prophecies about restoration, it's often said, and we even read Haftarah to that effect, that the restoration will be permanent.
Yes.
But obviously the restoration wasn't permanent.
Right.
We still accept it as true prophecy.
Right.
And as a Pashtan, especially, they seem to be not referring to a future redemption, but to that redemption after Babel.
Oh, that's a good question. We will discuss that. The idea of restoration, which is a central feature of Yirmiyahu, more than any other prophet, I would say. Even more than Yeshayahu also is restoration. And the question is, what does restoration mean? Is he talking about, because it does speak after 70 years. It's very clear, after 70 years, you're going to return. We'll get to these things in the future. But I would say that to strengthen your question, restoration in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the prophecies of Yirmiyahu, because Yirmiyahu is not just a prophet for the Jews. He's a prophet for the world. That's what it says, which is itself very interesting. And the prophets, we have several examples of the prophets who have prophecies about other nations. Yeshayahu has prophecies about other nations for several chapters. Yechezkel has prophecies for other nations, several chapters. Who else? Amos. So Amos begins. 6 different nations are mentioned, the first verses of Amos. Al-Shosha, Pishay, I think it's Ammon is the first one. Damascus is the second, I think. Damascus, Ammon, etc. I think Ammon's first, Damascus is second. So there are prophecies about the Sephania, little Sephania. That's a book we probably haven't seen too often. Sephania has a little chapter about the nations. Who's the first prophet to prophesy about the nations, by the way? Bilam. Bilam's the first and the only one in the Torah. Let me tell you what's going to happen at the end of days. Talks about Moab and other nations. Amalek, Edom, Ashur, Cani, Bilam. If you talk about a prophet, what a prophet is in the Bible, the guy who fits the bill is Bilam, not Moshe. Bilam. So that's very interesting. So we have Yirmiyahu prophesying about. So we have Amos, we have Yechezkel, we have Yeshayahu, the big 3. Yeshayahu, Yechezkel, about the nations. And then, of course, there's Tzfanya, Amos. If you want to throw in Bilam, you got 6 prophets talking about the nations. What's interesting, not for now, but is to compare and contrast the 6. For example, which nations? They're not always the same nations, and which ones are highlighted. So in Yirmiyahu, get this someday, we'll spend a lot of time, 2 nations are highlighted. Mitzrayim is one, and Babel is the other one. The book ends with Babel, actually. They think Yirmiyahu is a friend of Babel. When you read his prophecies about Babel, he's no friend of Babel. He hates Babel, actually, but Babel is the one assigned to do what they have to do. So that's now, why do I mention this? Because what you have in Yirmiyahu, more than any other prophet, is that for several of the nations, he talks about restoration. Egypt will someday be restored. Shav Hashem. Mitzrayim. Ammon will be restored. Moab will be restored. Elam will be restored. So it's not just the Jews that are being restored. Actually, several of the nations are being restored. Now, some are not. It's interesting which yes and which no. Stay tuned but that's an important point about restoration, which is it's not just a side point over here. It's going to be okay in the future. He talks about restoration for other nations, for several other nations, including he's truly a prophet to the nations. Okay, so all this is important, and we'll deal with it in depth, hopefully, in the future. But then we have just this week and next. I wanted to finish up just briefly what we started last week with chapter 23. Then we'll turn our attention to 17 and 18, and we'll stop with that. And the next semester we'll deal with the second half of Yirmiyahu. Now, there's something interesting at the end of chapter 23 that we didn't get to last week. I want to take a look at it very briefly, and that's the following. Chapter 23 is about, again, how can you tell who is the true prophet and not the true prophet? I just wanted to repeat from last week another point about the false prophet. It's also not clear what a false prophet is. Is a false prophet just a straight-up liar? Or is a false prophet somebody who believes that his prophecy is true, but is mistaken for any number of reasons? That's an open question. Okay, that we discussed last week. Now I wanted to mention one last thing about chapter 23 that is very interesting. And that is chapter 23. Now, very strange. Verse 33. I'll start before that. Let's start with verse 30 of chapter 23. L'chein, hineni al hanviim num Hashem. B'ganvei dvarai. God says, I am going to deal with these prophets who steal my words. Ish me'et re'ehu, one from his friend. Now, what is that critique? B'ganvei dvarai ish me'et re'ehu. That sounds like they are saying prophecies that someone else was saying. They're copying each other. Right. It's not clear whether the copying is true or false, but they're saying things in my name that I never said to them. So that's not right. The prophet can always say apparently what the prophet is told. The prophet cannot engage in any kind of plagiarism. That's out. Prophet can only deal with what the prophet is told directly. The prophet does not deal with repeat someone else's prophecy. Fine. So therefore, I know what these prophets are. This is a deception. This is an untruth. I'm going to deal with the prophets who it says wag their tongues and make oracular utterances. That sounds like they are talking without any kind of sanction for me. I never told them to talk. So now we have a new thing. I am opposed to the prophets who tell the people false dreams. Here we have the idea of the dream. Now, Vayisaprum vayatu et amei b'shikreihem u'b'pachasutam v'yochi lo shilachtim v'lo tzivitim v'oi lo yo'ilu lo amrazeh num Hashem. I never sent them, nor does their prophecy help them. That's another important factor. Does the prophecy help the people or not? You don't usually help people by saying you're doing great. You help them by correcting. So all of this is the critique of the prophet. Now here, what's interesting is the idea of the chalom. The dream, in the Torah, it speaks about a prophet or a dreamer. If there be amongst you a navi o cholem chalom. In the Chumash, when it says o cholem chalom, in chapter 13 of Devarim, so this last week, there's no suggestion that the one who has a chalom is saying something false. There is a distinction between a navi and a cholem chalom, but there's not a sense that the cholem chalom is just making something up or is just saying what he or she believes to be true. In fact, in the Chumash, we know that a person who might qualify as a navi, possibly, who talks about the future. Because the navi we first encounter in the Torah, which is Abraham, he prays. He's a navi, he's going to pray for you. That's chapter 20. But the navi, the person who predicts the future, you talk about the one in the first person, really a predictor of the future, I think we probably would agree that it's got to be Joseph. Joseph is a predictor of the future. Now, the other people don't like what the predictor is saying. And when Joseph comes to find his brethren, to make peace with them, the brothers say to each other, look who's coming, the dreamer is coming. And they take him. First, they want to just kill him straight out. And then they decide not to kill him straight out, but to cause his death by throwing him into a pit. There's only one other person in the Bible who they do exactly the same thing to. Try to kill him by throwing into a pit, and that's Yirmiyahu. So the Yirmiyahu story and the Joseph story have all kinds of interesting links. But Joseph is called the Cholem Chalom, Baal HaChalomot. There's no intimation in the Chumash on any level that his dreams are not going to come true. The opposite. He is a dreamer. His predictions all come true. Totally. So in the Chumash, I would say Cholem Chalom in the Chumash does not necessarily contradict being a predictor. Okay. There could be still a difference between the two, but it's not that one is true and one is false. But here in chapter 23 of Yirmiyahu, here you get a different sense. That the Cholem Chalom for chapter 23 is somebody who is simply talking from his own experience. The Chalom represents something about the person, as opposed to about God. So the Cholem Chalom is, as in here, I think, is as opposed to the prophet. The prophet brings God's word. The Cholem Chalom brings his own word or his friend's word, but not necessarily is a prophet at all. Yes. 28. Right. Hanovi asher ito chalom yisaper chalom. V'asher dvaro ito, dvari ito, yidaber dvari emet. I'm not sure that contradicts. I think he's saying something else.
It's possible that can be true. It depends whether
it's possible, right?
It comes from God or
that's true. But what does 28 mean? You raise a very good question. What does 28 mean? The prophet who has with him a dream should tell the dream. Cholamti, cholamti. Right. Ad motaya yesh b'leiv haleviyim dibei hasheker uleviyei tamit libam. Hachoshvim lashkiach et libam. So, well, be false. In other words, it's a good question. I mean, my take on it was that the chalom, it represents, in other words, it's like this. In other words, there's a distinction is being drawn. Maybe we'll say like this. There's a distinction being drawn between a chalom and a nevuah. The chalom is not necessarily false. It may be true. But if it's a chalom, you have to say, I had a dream. Not Martin Luther King's dream either, but I had a dream, and that may be true. But if it's a prophecy, then you can say, I had a nevuah. So if it's a chalom, you can't say it's a nevuah. Because there is some distinction between a chalom and a nevuah. You're right, it's not fully spelled out over here, but it's clear that there's a distinction between the two. And the chalom, I think, could carry with it a personal sense about something that I want. Our dreams are maybe what our aspirations, our hopes, our wishes. That's the chalom. And the nevuah is different. The nevuah is just with God's instruction. So there's that distinction being drawn over here. I mean, you could say the Chumash also distinguishes. But then when you read it, you get a sense that the chalom is one form of nevuah. There are different levels of prophecy. But here it sounds different. Okay, that point is well taken. In any event, fine. Now, here's the point I wanted to mention today, because it's very difficult to know what it means, and I find it extremely interesting. And that begins in verse 33 to the end of the chapter, 33 through 40 in chapter 23. When the people or a prophet or a priest asks you, what is Masah Hashem? Now, what does the word Masah mean? So Masah has many different meanings. Now, Masah can mean in the Bible a prophecy. Exactly. Took the words out of my mouth. And beyond that, the word Masah is often introduced as the prophecy of X is sometimes called the Masah. For example, Yeshayahu. Let's find Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu prophesies about the nations. So let's pick an example of that. Let's see. Find one here. Open it up right here. Chapter 21. Masah Midbar Yam. Masah Midbar Yam. Here they translate the desert of the sea pronouncement. That's Masah Midbar Yam. Masah Gechi Zayon, chapter 22. Masah Barav, chapter 21, verse 13. Masah Duma, chapter 21, verse 11. These are all prophecies. So the word Masah, which appears with other prophets as well, means a prophecy. So it's strange, right? Now the word Masah has another meaning, actually. A burden. A burden. And we'll see about the word Masah. There's something very curious about this. Right. Okay. That's true. So let's see what it says over here. The word Masah has two meanings, at least two, maybe more. Masah is something you pick up, something heavy off of a burden, or it's a pronouncement. Vayisah b'shalom vayomar. Another Bilam. Bilam is the great prophet, actually. It's talking about who represents what the prophet is. It's got to be Bilam, actually. So Vayisah b'shalom vayomar is a Bilam. So that's a Masah. Okay. Now, in the case of Bilam, it's certainly a Masah, because it's not a prophecy he wants to say. He was paid good money to say a different prophecy. So it's not something he wants to do at all. He can't help himself. He has no choice. In any event, now we come to Yirmiyahu. Yes, my friend.
You always have a bracha, and so the direct pipeline to God, that shorish.
Right.
Say kapayim, and you said bracha, and matzah, they're all related
To blessings, that's right.
Gloria.
That is true. 100% true. It's God oriented. That's true. But it does have the other meaning, though. Masah, as we'll see, Masah is, and Masah. My point is that the word Masah, just the word Masah itself. First thing I think of is our verses in the Bible which talk about prophecies. Not only Yeshayahu, there are other prophets as well. I don't have a concordance here, but if you look it up, I'm sure you'll find 10 or 15 times in the Bible where the prophecy is called the Masah. So what's curious is that over here, Yirmiyahu Yirmiyahu has a problem with the word Masah. When someone asks you, Ma Masah Hashem, what is God's prophecy? That's what we would say. What is God's pronouncement, right? V'yamarta alehem et ma Masah v'natashti etchem ne'um Hashem. So you shall answer them, what is the Masah? I will cast you off, says God. So the Masah means a burden. You're carrying a heavy package, right? Like you have in the Chumash, a heavy package on the animal. And the animal is struggling. So you have to help the person take the package off, right? What is the Masah? Someone says to you, what is the Masah? Say, I'll tell you what the Masah is. The Masah is a burden that God intends to unpack or to take off. I will abandon you, says God. Natashti etchem ne'um Hashem. So right away in this first verse, he's playing with the word Masah. Now the question is the word Masah something that Yirmiyahu finds problematic, or it's just a play on the word Masah? When you continue to read the Psukim, it sounds like he's bothered by the word Masah, actually, which is very strange. The word Masah is a very common word for prophecy in the Torah and beyond. Hanavi Kohen Va'am. Now the next verse. Asher Yomar Masah Hashem. Ufokaneti ala isha hahu bi'al beito. As for the prophet or the priest or the regular person who says Masah Hashem, I will punish that person and his house. So it sounds like saying Masah Hashem is very negative. If you say Masah Hashem, I will punish the person for saying what is so bad about Masah Hashem? Isaiah said it plenty. What?
He's
lying
talking
when
about
they
the
say it.
false prophets here.
They're lying when they
Because
say
with
it.
early Eastern European Jewish humor, these people are the culture already is to regard that word in the double way. That prophecies are regarded as burdens. So he's saying, if you take my word as a burden, I'm going to.
Could be. Okay, let's see if we can fine tune that. Okay, let's just read through it, see if we can fine tune it. Kol tamru ish areyehu, v'ish elochiv, ma'ana Hashem u'madiber Hashem. You shouldn't, when you speak about God talks, when you're talking about God's pronouncements, don't use the word burden, Masa Hashem, but say, what did God respond? What did God say? But don't use the language, what is the burden of God? What is the Masa Hashem? Don't use that word. Umasa Hashem otizkaruo. This word. Don't use that word anymore. Never use the word Masa. Ki amasa yiyeh ish devaro. V'afachtem et divrei Elohim chayim. Hashem tzvaot Eloheinu. Now, what does that verse mean? Let's see how they translate that. Fine. Do not mention the burden of the Lord anymore. Now here, was it meaning of, no, they have another variant reading. Here they translate in the JPS. Does a man regard his own word as a burden? That you pervert the words of the living God, the Lord of hosts, our God? So that seems to say, what you suggested, that they're seeing God's pronouncements as a burden. Does a person regard his own statements as a burden? If I'm talking, do I say what I'm saying? Oh, what I'm saying, it's such a pain and everything. It's such an imposition on everybody. No, when I talk, I think I'm saying something which is people want to hear, or something like, right? So it doesn't hurt anybody. So don't talk about God's word as being a burden, because that's a negative. Don't use that language, because God's word is not a burden. God's word is intended to help you, but not to burden you. So the word masa, which has two meanings, but the people are using masa in a pejorative, in a negative way. So here they're being told by Yirmiyahu is telling them not to use that language. Kol tamar hanavi, ma'anach Hashem u'madiber Hashem. Right. When you ask the prophet, say, what did God say? What did God respond? It repeats what's said earlier. Right. V'yimasa Hashem tomeru. But if you insist on using the word masa, lachein ko amar Hashem. Therefore, let me tell you what God is saying. This is the word of God. Yad amorchem et hadavar hazeh masa Hashem, v'eshlach alechem leimor lo tomru masa Hashem. Funny, I mean, what did God say about masa? Oh, here's the message. Don't use the word masa. All right, speaking of Jewish humor, that's the message, right? Lachein hineni v'nashiti etchem naso. And now it plays on the word masa in two senses. One is the word nashiti, and the second is the word naso. So the shin and the sin often in the Bible are used interchangeably, or they play off each other. There are many examples of that. It's good to know. What does nashiti mean? Nashiti is like, well, nashiti I would say means like menashe, to forget, to put out of sight. Means to put out of sight. That's to draw out. Nashiti is like menashe. Lenashot means to forget. So I will cast you aside. Naso. I hear it translated. I will utterly forget you and cast you away. Okay. You v'natashti etchem v'yetoir asher natati lachem v'ravotechem v'yalponai. I will. Maybe I would say I will unburden myself. I will cast off. Right. To cast off or take off the city and the place. Right. V'natati alechem cherpat olam. And I will place upon you eternal scorn. So the placing upon is the masa. So plays on the word masa. You want to know what the masa is? What's going to be placed upon you? That's the masa. What's placed upon you is cherpat olam, uchimot olam asher lo tishacheach, and again, shame for all time, not to be forgotten. Now, so that's the chapter ends with this question of, once again, talk about prophecy, about Masa Hashem. So one way to understand it is Masa means, objectively speaking, is a pronouncement of God. That's for sure. But the people are seeing it differently. The people are seeing God's pronouncements as burdens. I would just add a small formulation, maybe a slightly different formulation of this, which is that the people, in other words, the prophecy is the burden is that Masa Hashem sounds like, what is the burden that God? It's God's burden. In other words, there's something negative about that. But the point of it, I think, is it's not the Masa is not God's Masa, but the reality is that the intention of the prophet is to place upon the people a burden, in the sense it's the people's decision how to. What God is giving them as an opportunity. It's not untrue that there's a burden here, in the sense that there's a responsibility. All responsibilities are involve some kind of sacrifice of one sort or another. So that's not the problem. The problem is they're shifting the burden idea to God, as opposed to seeing themselves as being responsible. It's a way to divest themselves of responsibility. It's all God's fault. It's stuff that God places upon us. And God's answer is, I'm not placing anything upon you. What I place upon you is a function of your own behavior. So the Masa is, I think what angers God over here is that by saying it's all on God, as it were, it's a rejection of the idea of the prophet who's instructing the people what their obligations are, what their Masa is, in fact. Yeah.
You could say not using it as a noun, as a burden. You can say it's using it as an adjective. It's burdensome. The news is bad news. So the substance of the Masa is it's burdensome to the people.
I like that. Yeah, that's a nice formulation. Yeah, and it comes back to the question of the prophet again, because Yirmiyahu's life is dedicated to correcting people's mistakes, basically, and people don't want to hear that, So he has all kinds of negative consequences for himself, his own personal life. He's also instructed to sort of live out the prophecy, which he does, and other prophets as well. So I just wanted to finish with this word. Now, what struck me as interesting is the following. This is chapter 23. I wanted to go back and for this set of classes, to look at chapter 7, the end of chapter 17 and chapter 18. And then we'll stop with that. And the next semester, we'll deal with the second half of Yirmiyahu. The end of chapter 17 is something very unusual here, which is, at the end of chapter 17, Yirmiyahu singles out a particular mitzvah that the people are not observing. He singles out a mitzvah. In general, in this book, it's rare that he singles out any mitzvah. There is a story later on that we came across tangentially about freeing the slaves, taking the slaves back. But for the most part, he talks in general terms. You didn't obey my voice. You broke my covenant. These are general terms, and the Torah often speaks in general terms as well. But here, at the end of chapter 17, lo and behold, he singles out one mitzvah. Now, it's not a small mitzvah, but he singles out one mitzvah that the people have failed to observe. The mitzvah is the mitzvah of Shabbat. That's not so surprising. But what's striking is that what he singles out in terms of Shabbos is the word Masa. I've always wondered about this, as is there a connection between, there's got to be a link between these two things. Because each of these two sections is extremely unusual. The idea of a long section at the end of chapter 23, which talks about the prophet and the false and true prophet, which deals with the word Masa in a pejorative way, when elsewhere in the Bible, we just take for granted that the word Masa means a prophecy. That's very striking. And then in chapter 17, when he talks about not observing the Shabbat, and as we'll read now, the key word seems to be the word Masa. There's got to be a link between those two things. So let's leave that for the open for now. Let's start with end of chapter 17. Chapter 17, by the way, is a well-known chapter because the first part of 17 is one of the Haftarot. So Haftorah, interestingly enough, this is actually very, store this now as I'm talking. It's the Haftorah for Parshat, is it Bahar Bechukotai? Who has a rough and read together? I believe it's for Bechukotai. Is that true?
No.
Let's take a look. Let's see.
Maybe not.
Well,
No, it is.
it's either Bahar or Bechukotai. Which one is it? So they're often read together, so I don't know.
Page 1177.
All right. That's what the Haftorah is on the back there. Okay, let's see.
Okay, so Bahar is Yirmiyahu Lamed Bet.
And that's not it. What's the next? What's Bechukotai? Right.
And Uzziah.
Right. So it's Bechukotai. Now here's what's very interesting. Extremely. Right. That's the last verse of the Haftorah. The last verse of the Haftorah is chapter 17, verse 14. Rifa'eli Hashem ve'erofei. And the Haftarah begins in chapter 16, and it's mostly chapter 17. Now, it's the Haftarah for Bechukotai, right? The Parshat Bechukotai, which is the last chapter of Vayikra, is fundamentally most of the reading is the admonition, is the Tochacha. That's Bechukotai. The long chapter in Vayikra is the Tochacha, most of which are the punishments for failure to observe the Torah generally, and specifically one mitzvah, which is the mitzvah Shemitah, which is describing the previous chapter, V'shavta Aretz Shabbat Lashem. So the failure to observe Shabbos actually is what is the cause of the exile. The exile, which will be temporary exile, right? And God brings you back at the end. Now, the temporary exile that God brings you back at the end, which Yirmiyahu says will last for 70 years, right, is actually referenced at the end of the book of Chronicles, the last book we have in our Bible. At the very end, it says, toward the very, very end, it says that, because Chronicles is written as a later book. So in Book of Chronicles, it says, right the very, very end of the Bible, it says, Vayego Hasheri min Acherev el Bavel, Vayulo banav avodim, until the Persians come. Limalot devar Hashem b'fi Yirmiyahu, chapter 36, verse 21. It's 3 verses before the end of the Bible. To fulfill the word that came from Jeremiah the prophet. Ad ratzta aretz et shabtoteha, until you pay back the Sabbath years. Kol yemei hashama shavata, all the days it shall lie desolate. Limalot shivim shana. So I actually hypothesized this. I see it's an explicit verse in the Bible that the exile of 70 years is to pay back the Sabbath years you didn't, the 10 Sabbath years you didn't keep. Us tirtzeh eretz shabtoteha, which of course are the verses in Parshat Bechukotai. So it's seeing Jeremiah's prophecy of exile as a fulfillment of the Tochacha. Here's a question I wanted to raise. That's an interesting question. That's chapter 17. The Haftorah ends in the middle of chapter 17. But the end of chapter 17, just a few verses later, is all about the Shabbos. It's about failure to observe Shabbos. So you got to wonder, actually, I wonder, whether when they chose these Haftarot, they weren't thinking more globally about chapter 17. Because that's what chapter 17 is actually about. You failed to observe the picked out to represent all the mitzvot in Jeremiah. Chapter 17 is the Shabbos, which is exactly the mitzvah that's picked out in the Torah in Bechukotai and Bahar, that you fail to observe the Sabbath, therefore you go into exile, and the Haftarah for Bechukotai is Jeremiah 17. So it gets you to wonder, I think, about when they make these decisions about what Haftarah to choose, What are they looking at really? Is it just these few words, or are they looking more at the character of the broader context? Because the broader context dovetails perfectly with Bechukotai. It's actually exactly Bechukotai. That yes, you didn't observe the covenant, but one mitzvah is singled out, which is the Sabbath of the land, which is Shabbos. Shemitah is basically Shabbos. It's called Shabbos. Anyway, let's take a look now at the end of 17, and then we'll continue today or next week with chapter 18, which is a very famous chapter. We're all familiar with chapter 18. For other reasons, we'll get to it. Yes, my friend.
When you recommend a new God, the exile relates to the land, the Shemitah relates to the land. So you don't observe the Shabbos that you're supposed to do with respect to the land. Therefore, that land will vomit you out.
Land vomits you out, and the land then keeps the Shemitah. It's two sides to it. It vomits you out, but it also keeps the Shemitah, the years, because Shemitah means you don't work the land. Okay, you work the land then, so you got to pay back your debts. So for X number of years, the land will be empty, and then the land will. The Torah says it. Us to sell, us to shop to tell. Then you're going to pay back the Sabbath years that you didn't keep when you were there. Kol Yemei HaShabbat Tishbot. The chronicler cites the verse in the Chumash word for word. Actually, it's a straight out quote from the Chumash, which is another very interesting question we'll get to in Yirmiyahu, which is a fascinating question. We can't solve all the problems. Let's start now with the end of 17, and then we'll continue this week or next with 18. Ko Amar Hashem, Ki Shamru B'nafshotechem. This is extremely unusual for the book of Yirmiyahu, 52 chapters, but he almost never singles out a mitzvah, just over here. V'yal tis'u masa b'yom HaShabbat v'aveitem b'sharei Yerushalayim. So what he singles out, actually, is do not carry masa. Masa is something that you carry. Sometimes called a burden, all right? A masa, so it's basically carrying. It's carrying, but it may be more than just carrying, but don't carry stuff on Shabbos and bring it into the gates of Jerusalem, right? V'lo totziu masa mibatechem b'yom HaShabbat. V'chol melacha lo ta'asu. And do not take out these burdens from your homes on the Shabbat, right? And don't do any mulacha. That's a general. Kol mulacha lo ta'asu is a general statement. Don't work on the Sabbath. V'kidashtem et yom HaShabbat, but rather sanctify the day of the Sabbath. Kasher tziviti et avotechem. V'lo shamu, but they refused to listen. V'lo itu et aznav, v'yikshu et arpam, v'ilti shemoa. And they refused to listen. They were very stubborn. They didn't take my teaching. But you, v'ayam shemoa tishma'un, elaynu Hashem. But if you will listen, if you will obey, livilti havi masa, b'sharei o'ir azot, b'yom HaShabbat, that not to bring the burdens through the city gates, right? The masa. U'kadesh et yom HaShabbat, livilti asot bo kol melacha, and to sanctify, do no labor, do no work. It's interesting, by the way, that here, already in these verses, you get a sense of what the Tosafos said on Tractate Shabbat. They distinguish between carrying and all other work. The Mishnah in Shabbos, actually the Mishnayot in Shabbat in general, Tractate Shabbat, it's a long tractate. There are two main kinds of work that the Mishnah is concerned about. The first is carrying. It spends a lot of time about carrying. And the other is cooking or making fires, which is what the Torah actually, when the Torah talks about Shabbat, that's basically what the Chumash speaks about, right? Not to leave your place, etc. Not to go out and collect the food and bring it back. So here you get, it's interesting, here, don't take a masa and don't do malacha. As if malacha is one thing and masa is something else, and the focus is equally, if not more so, on masa. We'll get to this in 2 minutes, and it is malacha, that to bring the masa in through the gates of the city. So if you obey me, says God, then ubal b'sharei or irazot, and through these very gates will come mulachim v'sarim, yoshvim achisei David, rochvim b'rechev u'vasusim, hema v'sareim, ish Yehuda v'yoshvei Yerushalayim, V'yashva ir azot liolam, be restored forever. If you don't carry through the burdens through the gates, then you will have royalty, right? And notice here, by the way, a side point we get to later in the year. Kisei David. Yirmiyahu emphasizes very much the idea of David and David's line being the ultimate kingship. It's not in any manner, shape, or form rejecting the kingship of David. That's an important point. The line of David will be restored forever through these very gates. Uvo v'yarei Yehuda v'misvivot Yerushalayim Eretz Binyamin min Ashvela min Ahar min Hanegev Miviyim olav zevach mincha uvana umiviyei toda beit Hashem, and from all the surrounding areas, people will come to bring sacrifices, various sacrifices, and gifts of thanksgiving to God's house. That's if you do it. V'im lo tishmu elai. But if you don't listen, u'kadesh et yom HaShabbat, u'levilti sa'it masa. And if you don't listen and you do carry the masa, sa'it masa, u'ba b'sharei Yerushalayim b'yom HaShabbat, and you come into Jerusalem on the Sabbath, v'tzati eish b'shareach, then these very gates will be burnt down. V'yachla armenot Yerushalayim v'lo tichbeh, and they will devour the fortresses of Jerusalem, and the fire will not be extinguished. And by the way, it's interesting over here, coming back to my previous point, not only is the Sabbath singled out over here, but it's the same formula I have in the Chumash too. If you do this, blessing. If you don't do this, curse. It's exactly the formula of the Tochacha. So actually, the perfect Haftorah for Parshat Bechukotai are these verses. It's exactly these verses. We couldn't do a better job. It's simply, but for whatever reason, they didn't choose that, but they chose what actually precedes it. Same chapter, actually. They chose that as the Haftorah. Now, so let's say the following. First, Yirmiyahu singles out the Shabbos. Now, he's not the first prophet to single out the Shabbos. We have the Shabbat singled out by a different prophet, very famously, and at least in two places, both of which, by the way, are haftarot. Both are haftarot. Both, and they're two very prominent haftarot, two of the most beautiful haftarot that we have, and not surprisingly, they come from the book of Yeshayahu. Neither of which is part of what's called Shiva de Nechemta. Neither of which is a haftarah of consolation. Quite the opposite. But they are two haftarot. One is Isaiah, chapter 56, and one is Isaiah, chapter 58. They are very famous and beautiful haftarot, two of my favorites. So let's just take a look. And there, Yeshayahu mentions the Shabbos. Let's see if we find this. First of all, Isaiah 56. Actually, the Haftarah begins in Isaiah 55. Verse number 6 begins with the verse, Tirshu Hashem b'hi matzo, kra'u b'yoto karov. Seek out God when God is present. Call to God when God is near. Tirshu Hashem b'hi matzo, kra'u b'yoto karov is the Haftarah for all of our fast days. It's the Haftarah for the fast days. It's a call to repentance, and it is a rather striking Haftarah. It talks about the good things that will happen. I mean, I'm not going to go through the Haftarah now. It's a very beautiful Haftarah. And in chapter 56, which is the continuation of 55, obviously, in the Haftarah, Ko Amar Hashem, Shemru Mishpat V'asu Tzedakah. So God says, instructs you, one of the favorite themes of Yeshayahu from beginning to end, both the first part of Isaiah and the second, Shemru Mishpat and Tzedakah, observe what is right, do what is just, right? Because my salvation shall come, my deliverance will be revealed, right? Ashrei Anoshi Asezot, Uben Adam Yachazikpa. Happy is the one who does this. Does what? Mishpat and Tzedakah. Mishpat and Tzedakah, right? Shomer Shabbat Mechalilo. V'shomer yado me'asot kol ra. One who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and stays his hand from doing any evil. So what is very striking over here is the mention of the Shabbat in this context, because it's not a context you expect to find it. The previous verse says, do righteousness and mishpat and tzedakah, right? And the second half of verse number 5 is, shomer yado me'asot kol ra, one who guards his hand from doing any evil, doesn't strike somebody, doesn't steal, whatever it is. And right in the middle of it, happy is the one who does this, shomer Shabbat mechalulo, who observes the Sabbath, who does not profane the Sabbath. So what is Yeshayahu getting at by mentioning the Shabbat over here? And by the way, this is not the end of the Shabbat in chapter 56 or the Haftorah, because he continues later on, and this is very famous. Al Yomar ben Hanechar, he talks about the foreigner. Hanuval Hashem leimar, the one who was joined to God. Havdel Yavdileni Hashem Yalamo, V'Ayomar Saris. The eunuch should not say, I'm a withered tree. Kicho Amar Hashem, Lasarisim Asher Yishmeru et Shabtotai, Uvacharu B'Asher Chafatzti, Umachzikim Bivriti. Those, the eunuchs, Saris is typical eunuch, who keep my Sabbath, who choose what I desire. V'Natati Lahem, V'Veitiu V'Chomotai Yad Vashem. I will give them a name and a remembrance. The Haftorah is, it's a beautiful Haftorah here. So Yad Vashem comes from over here. For those who observe, for Isaiah, by the way, unlike others, it's all about, it doesn't matter where you come from for him. There's no priestly class for Yeshayahu. It's everybody, whoever wishes, whoever connects to God, to serve God and love God, to be God's servants, as he says in verse number 6, U'bnei Anechan nevim al Hashem l'sharto, u'yavad shem Hashem u'yotu l'avodim, to be God's servant. Kol shomer Shabbat mechalelo u'machzikim bivriti. He beats you over the head with this. Those who observe this, who do not profane the Sabbath, who observe my covenant. And then he continues, for those people, haviotim ohar kodshi v'simachtim b'veit tfiloti, I'll bring them to my house. Olotehem b'zivchehem l'ratzonam mizbechi, ki beit tfiloi yikarei, ki beiti yikarei l'chol ha'amim, all the nations, everybody's welcome. It's the house for the world. All those who connect to God. Num Hashem Elohim, Chabes Nitchei Yisrael, from the God who gathers the dispersed of Israel. So here you have, in chapter Isaiah 56, in the context of justice, covenant, okay, Shabbat in terms of covenant is not so surprising. But Shabbat in terms of Mishpat and Tzedakah is surprising. And the focus on this, that of course anybody who wishes to observe the Sabbath, who wishes to be God's servant, is welcome. God's house is for everybody, for Israel, not just for the Jews, the world. That's 56. Now you would just turn the page to 58, another famous Haftorah. It begins, I believe, let's see, where does it begin? Yes. Yudao, that's where it's right. So this Haftorah, it's one of the more beautiful Haftorah we have. So was the previous one. This is very striking. Solu. When is this Haftorah read? Who knows? Yes, the Haftorah for Yom Kippur, actually. Yom Kippur morning. It's a definition of what Yom Kippur is about, actually. It's the most beautiful thing we have in our liturgy. 58. It's the end of 57. Every fast day. Tirshu Hashem B'hi Matzah. It's read in fast days. They're both read on fast days, actually. Right. Yom Kippur is also a fast day, right? Yom Kippur is also a fast day. So the point is, Solu Panadarech, Harim Michshol, that's how it begins. Take away the stumbling blocks. Koma Ram V'Nisa. So this is right. So the Haftorah, actually, of Yom Kippur, in the Haftorah, talks about seeking out God, peace for those far and near. And then in chapter 58, there's a complaint. The people have a complaint. We don't understand it. We're fasting. How come you're paying no attention to our fast? People have a question. Yeshayahu asked the question for us. We're fasting. What is this over here? So So the answer is found in chapter 58. It's an Haftarah for Yom Kippur, actually, in the middle of the fast. We're fasting all day, right? It's Haftarah. It's about, 12 o'clock now? We're really hungry. What's wrong? We're fasting, right? So the answer is, right? God's answer is, because verse number 4, 5. Do you think I desire your fast? In verse 4, it says, you fast in strife and contention. You strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting today is not such as to make your voice heard on high. In Kitzer, your fasting doesn't so much interest me, actually. I don't care about your fast. But rather, let me tell you what you should be doing. Yom Anot Adam Nafsho. You said, is this a fast to starve yourself, right? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush, right? You call that a fast? And now in verse 6, he says, and now Yisrael describes the fast day, what it's supposed to be. Pateach chatzubot resha, hater agudot mota, sharach ritzutzim chavshim, v'chol mota tinateku. Rofaros l'ra'ev lachmecha ariyim rudim tavibayit, ki tereh arom v'chisito, umibsarcha lo titalam. Now this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness, untie the cords of the yoke, let the oppressed go free, break every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry, take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, clothe him, do not ignore your own kin. That's the fast that I desire. Then your light will burst like dawn. I mean, Sheol, something like it. It's gorgeous. Goes on and on this way. Then you cry and I will listen, right? And he continues later on. In verse 10, offer your compassion to the hungry, satisfy the famished creature, then your light will shine in darkness, and your gloom will be like noonday. God will guide you forever, right? Then it goes on, and God will build your ancient ruins, restore foundations, right? And then verse 13, all of a sudden, Im tashiv mishabat raglecha. That's a Shabbos, all of a sudden. Middle of nowhere. Im tashiv mishabat raglecha, asod chafatzecha biyom kodshi, v'karatu la Shabbat oneg Shabbos. If you keep the Shabbat, l'kdosh Hashem mechubad, covered Shabbos, covered and oneg come from this verse. Covered Shabbos and oneg Shabbos from here. Keep on it, told me asod trachecha, mitzochef secha v'dabir. All these are halachic categories. Dabir davar. Your speech on Shabbos is not like the rest of the week, etc. Don't engage in your own personal pursuits on the Shabbat. Then you will rejoice in God. Of course, the choosing of this Haftarah for Yom Kippur has the genius of it is that it includes both about fasting, but it's also about Shabbos. Yom Kippur is at the end of the day, Shabbat Shabbatonu Lachem. So what better choice could there be for Haftarah for Yom Kippur than a chapter that talks about Shabbos on one hand and fasting on the other? And there is only one such chapter in the Bible, which is Isaiah 58, and apart from that, it defines what the fast day is, which is not that it's opposed to the fast, but the fast in combination with, that's the real fast. The other stuff is secondary. In any event, that could be. That's right. It could be real Shabbos. But the point I wanted to make, you have these are two examples where you have a prophecy in which Shabbat becomes important into the prophecy, right? He doesn't mention Yom Kippur here. I mean, it's the rabbinic tradition assigns it to Yom Kippur. Nothing to do with Yom Kippur. I mean, it's about fasting, yes. Why are we fasting and you're not listening to us, right? So these two Haftarot, 56, 58, just to read them, it's beautiful. I mean, there's something like it. So here we have two examples where Shabbat is singled out, and there's a third place in the Bible too. Who knows where the third place is? Even Suri's not going to know this one. It's singled out is there's a concern about the people's behavior, and in particular, there's a focus on the Shabbat. I'll tell you where it is. It's not No, Esther doesn't mention Shabbat at all. No. No. The Chumash mentions it many times. But I'm saying a story in the Bible, a story actually, where someone singles out the Shabbat. He's very concerned about the people's concerned about other things as well, but in particular, the behavior of Shabbat. It's in the Nehemiah. It's in Nehemiah, at the very end of Nehemiah, very end, right towards the end of the Bible. And he talks about it. It's at the very, very, very end of the book, right? In chapter 13 of Nehemiah, the last chapter of Nehemiah. And he's concerned about two things in chapter 13. One of which we already have in Ezra, and that is the fact that the returnees from Bavel have non-Jewish wives. And that's one of the concerns about what do you do with the non-Jewish wives. So that is the concern of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's a whole big deal. That's a big thing in both books. That's one thing. But just prior to that, beginning in chapter 13, you have the following. Chapter 13, verse 15. Wait. What time is it now? I have absolutely no clue.
You're about 8 minutes.
8 minutes is all we have left?
No, 10 minutes.
10. 10, that's different. Okay. Right. All right. Right. Okay. Now look at this over here. Now, look at this. This is chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. Right. It's funny that Nehemiah, every so often, by the way, turns to God and says, remember me for good. He says it several times. In fact, it's the last verse. He's very concerned about it. He wants to get the right credit. Okay. It's entitled, I guess. So now, in those days, Ra'iti bihuda dorchim gitot b'Shabbat. U'miviyim aremot v'yomsim ala chamorim v'yafyayin anovim teinim v'chol masa miviyim Yerushalayim b'yom HaShabbat. V'a'id b'yom michram tzayid. So it says, at that time, I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and others bringing heaps of grain and loading them onto asses, also wine, grapes, figs, all sorts of good, loading masa, and bring them to Jerusalem on the Sabbath. I admonished them. V'atzorim yashvu ba b'viyim dug, and the Tyrians brought at fish. V'chol mecher u'mochrim b'Shabbat l'bnei Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. And they would brought the fish in there, and there was a whole big market. They're selling their fish on Shabbat. V'yariva et chorei Yehuda, and I had a fight with the nobles of Judah. V'omro lahem, ma davar hara hazeh asher atem osim u'mechalim et yom HaShabbat. V'lo ko asu avotechem. V'yavego heinu aleinu et kol hara hazot v'yala'ir hazot. V'yatem mosifim charona Yisrael v'chaler ot HaShabbat. He says this is not appropriate. This is what got us in trouble the first time. You can't desecrate the Sabbath. V'hi kasher tzolu sharei Yerushalayim lifnei HaShabbat. When the shadows filled the city of Jerusalem before Shabbat, it's twilight, right? V'omra v'yisagru hadulatot. I commanded before the Shabbat, when the sun is setting, it's like you have in Jerusalem nowadays. They make, what's it, siren, or what do they have?
Yeah.
The sirens. The Mishnah is talking about that, making the tkiyos before Shabbat. Shabbos is coming, so we have it over here. I commanded before the Shabbat that they should close the doors. And not let anybody in until after Shabbat. And I had my servants stood by the gates. Shabbos patrol. Do not permit any burdens to enter in on Shabbat. So outside the walls, right outside the gates, they were sleeping. The merchants were sleeping right outside the walls. I said to them, what are you sleeping outside the walls for? If you continue with this practice, maybe they're trying to get into the city on the Shabbat, I'm gonna act against you. I'm gonna harm you. I'm gonna raise my hand against you. And from that point on, they did not come. And I warned the Levium also to guard the gates. There's a halach of guarding the temple. So I told guard the gates of the city, right? It's the Turi character we have. So I mean, the Turi character, the Turi Shomrei Ha'ir, right? So the point is, so now we have three stories actually. So Nehemiah singles this out actually, specifically Shabbat, and he actually mentions Masah a couple of times as well, carrying burdens in. He does it. He talks about buying and selling is what he's talking about. So now we have three examples, and the question is, what is the primary point of each of these three stories? They're all similar in a sense. You have the two prophets, each of which mentions Shabbat, I would say unexpectedly. But Isaiah has one particular focus, I think, and Yirmiyah is something else, and Nehemiah is something else. So these are the three. So what do you think about these three cases? These are the three cases we have in the Bible, to the best of my knowledge, these three. What is the focus? I think Yeshayahu is the easiest of the three. Because Yeshayahu, I think his concern in that chapter, he says it pretty much straight out. Two words, mishpat and tzedakah. He's concerned with people behaving ethically. That's his concern, which he sees as the deepest religious obligation. It's not just it's a personal obligation. You want to be in God's good graces, he says. So the fasting is a very nice thing, but that's not what it's about. It's about what he says, pateach hartzubot resha, to unchain, to act in a way that is moral and is compassionate. That's what it's about. And I think the Shabbat for Yeshayahu, and this is in the Chumash already, the Shabbat, certainly in Sefer Devarim, is the focus there is why do you observe the Shabbos in the Ten Commandments? Remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. It doesn't mention that in the Ten Commandments in Exodus, but it mentions that in the Ten Commandments in Sefer Devarim. And in our Kiddush, for example, we mention both. In Kiddush, we say Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit and Zecher Yitziat Mitzrayim. So in Devarim, it's in Zecher. So what does it mean, Zecher Yitziat Mitzrayim? What does Shabbat have to do with Yitziat Mitzrayim? Because remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And remember that you didn't get any Shabbos there. When you worked for Pharaoh and you wanted to get off for a few days, how could you cause the people not to work? He says, there's so many, I can't afford it, whatever it is. And then when we leave Egypt and we work for God and we build the Mishkan, so there the Torah emphasizes, but not on Shabbos. Shabbos, nobody works on Shabbos. And not only that, you free everybody from labor. You don't work, your family doesn't work, your children don't work, your slaves don't work, nobody works, your animals don't work. So it's something very democratic about the Shabbat, and that is, it's moving towards the respecting the other person. So everybody stands before God equally. That's the idea of the Shabbat, the ultimate idea of Shabbat, and that's what Yeshayahu is emphasizing. That's in conjunction with opening, the feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and all of that. Im tashiv mishabat raglecha. For him, it's all part of the same thing, because he's the ultimate Democrat. Yeshayahu in the Pshat, I think, is not just a Democrat amongst the Jewish people. He's actually a Democrat, period, because he actually doesn't seem to believe that it makes one whit of difference where you're coming from. B'nei Hanechar, the eunuchs, the foreigners, the strangers, the Nachri, they can work in the temple like everybody else. It is basically, it's a universal message. That's his message. I'm creating a new world, he says at the end, and everybody stands equally before God. Everybody has to be God's servant. That's what he says. That's the pshat of Yeshayahu. It's very radical, but that's what he says. So the Shabbos for him is has a deep ethical dimension. That's as far as he's concerned. The question is, we have two other stories. We have our book, Yirmiyahu, and we have that story at the end of Nehemiah, actually, right towards the end of the Bible, so the question is, those two, are they identical? Or what is the main point? What is Yirmiyahu's main point? What's his concern over here? And what is the concern of Nehemiah? Or it's a question. What do you think?
So fundamental, it represents the bridge between God and Jewish people. And this whole book is about the fact that they're not keeping.
It does, but the funny thing, does he actually ever mention the word Brit? He never actually says it, does he? It's very strange in a way.
Asking them to take back their rights that they were given. They did lose
I'll tell you what I yeah, what do you want to say?
Observing the Shabbat is such an obvious public kind of thing that when it's violated, it's like it just affects everything and everybody. So many of the other things are much more private. If you don't keep kosher, who knows except somebody in your own house.
Right. So you're saying that I think in both of those cases, I think it's a very good point. I think that, sure, that basically Yirmiyahu emphasizes coming through the gates, basically. In other words, the public nature of it as opposed to, right? Nehemiah has that as well. I think there's a difference between them. I think there's something to be said for, I think in Nehemiah you get the sense that the Shabbat is not just any ordinary day. I think that what he's concerned about is, and this is actually, even in Yeshayahu, you have this as well, that the behavior on Shabbat is different than you behave the rest of the day. The kind of clothing you wear on Shabbat is different. The way you walk is different. The way you talk is different. What your interests are. So it's. I would say that in Nehemiah, I would say in Nehemiah it's actually about preserving Jewish identity, which is why he links it to the other business of the wives, and that basically everybody has to work. Everybody works. You know what I mean? But on Shabbos, it's different. That I think is the focus. I'll tell you something. One of my teachers, great teachers, who was very emphasized this point tremendously, was Rabbi Soloveitchik. Forget what you can and can't do. Forget about malacha. He was very, very, very strict on you don't behave the same way on Shabbat. You don't wear the same clothing. You don't walk the same way. It's a completely other experience. That I think is the focus in Nehemiah, because he's trying to be coming back from exile. He wants to establish who are we? Are we just another? We have to be different in some positive sense, and I think his focus is on establishing Jewish identity through acts of separation, or through distinctions that we make. I think that's the focus in Nehemiah. I think your point about the public side of Shabbat, which is covenantal. And it's funny thing about Shabbat, actually, and I'll just conclude with this, that's the only mitzvah we have, the only one, where there is a halachic distinction between the violation of Shabbat privately and the violation publicly. There's no other mitzvah we have. If you're not supposed to do something, you don't do it privately or publicly. The Jewish law doesn't distinguish, except in one case, B'chal Shabbat b'Farhesia, because it has a covenantal side to it. So the covenantal side to it dictates that when you do publicly, when you display publicly, have implications beyond what you just do privately or just the act itself. So I think I think it is true that in Yirmiyahu, it's about reestablishing the connection to God, which has been broken, and he sees Shabbat as the ultimate covenantal mitzvah, despite the fact he doesn't mention the word covenant, but as you say very well, he mentions the public nature of it. In Nehemiah, it's about identity. It's an identity issue. In Isaiah, it's about justice. Shabbat is as a democratic day. So the same mitzvah appears in three different places. I think it has three different senses. So next week, last class for this session, next week we'll start with chapter 18, which is also a very famous chapter, chapter 18. Kachomer biyad hayotzer, chapter 18. Maybe we'll sing it too, who knows?
When do you start up again in January?
It's very